Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to the Farmer's Table. My name is Jess, and I am so glad to have you here in my kitchen today. Here on my channel, we talk about all things real food, preserving it, preparing it, and enjoying it. And if you are not new here, welcome back. I'm so glad you're back. Today's video is going to be a little bit of an introduction. I just want to lay a foundation for some future content. Today, I want to talk to you all about the basics of home canning. So when I started making content in the homesteading sphere several years ago, I had absolutely no clue how volatile and divisive this very topic could be. I stumbled into it with a lot of naivety, not knowing that I was going to kick a hornet's nest. And what I've found at this point with my experience of kicking said hornet's nests is that there are two very distinct camps in the home canning community. You have your rule followers that absolutely look at the USDA guidelines as the Bible of home canning that you must follow no matter what. You have your rebels that think there's nothing at all good about following those guidelines, that are oftentimes doing things in complete disregard of those guidelines. And in full transparency, I'm kind of in the middle of those camps. I can't say that I ascribe to either of those strong opinions that either of those have. And what I have found is whenever you share anything that goes against one of those camps, you have one group telling you you're going to kill your family with botulism and another group telling you that you are a government sheep. So trying to find the middle ground on how we're going to home can. Here's my opinion for what it's worth. My humble opinion. This is my channel, and that's what I have to share is my experience. I am a big believer in understanding best practices so you can make an informed decision as to when you don't want to follow it. I do not take anything that the USDA puts out as my Bible or my guideline. I definitely do not even look at that as the rules. What I have found in sharing content is that people all over the world are successfully doing things, not following what our USDA tells us to do. However, if you are going to start canning, the USDA's website of their 40-page home canning preservation guide is the first place that I'm going to send you, because it tells you everything that can go wrong. It gives a lot of information about temperatures and what must be met, what elevation does to different canning experiences. I mean, tons and tons of information and illustrations. And I think that it's very wise to go there to familiarize yourself with what these best practices are. I don't view them as rules. I view them as best practices. Now, I think that it is foolish to disregard studies and best practices and other people's experience when we're deciding how to do something. If we're going to call them rules, I think that it's wise to know the rules so that you can decide to break them safely. So I am definitely in the middle ground. I typically do teach towards best practices. I may make decisions for myself out of my own experience and my own education that deviate from those things. When I'm teaching, I typically do err on the side of best practices because I don't want to assume that everybody who's listening to me has the capacity to make those informed decisions. Now, if I ever do decide to deviate from what the USDA or the ball canning guide, which is what most people use as the approved canning approach, if I ever decide to deviate from that, I will always tell you that I'm deviating from it, and I will tell you why. I think that that's probably the best way that I can approach teaching home canning, because I am somewhat laid back. I am not afraid of poisoning my family. In my experience, canning is 85% common sense and 15% technicality. So I feel very confident that my home canned foods are safe, but I will share my process with you honestly and transparently. And I encourage you to do your own research and find what you are most comfortable with. So right behind me here, I have my pressure canner. Over here, I've got my water bath canner sitting out. I'm not using it today. And in this pot, I've actually got some beans heating up because the video I'm shooting next is how to can dry beans at home. But I realized upon preparing that video that it would probably be better to lay a little bit of groundwork for people who are brand new to canning. So that's what this is. This is just the Canning 101. If you want to see the actual teaching content of recipes and canning processes, make sure you're subscribed. The next video will be one of those. So there are two main ways to can at home, which by canning I mean preserving food in jars. taking it to the point that it will be shelf stable through the canning process. Here I have my All-American 21 quart pressure canner, and here I have the water bath canner that I most commonly use. You do not have to have a special pot for water bath canning. I'll come back to that. So water bath canning and pressure canning are the two main ways of canning. There are a couple other approaches to canning, namely steam canning, and they've now made these electric pressure canners, but I have zero experience with those. So at this current point, you can expect water bath canning and pressure canning, and that is extremely versatile, and we're going to cover a lot of things with those two approaches. So the way canning works is you are taking perishable food items and you are preparing them in such a way, putting them in jars and putting them through the canning process, either water bath or pressure canning. That is going to break down and kill the enzymes in that jar. It's going to remove the air, creating a vacuum, and that is going to inhibit bacterial growth. So this is why best practices can be very important. There are things that really help aid making sure the process works well, like using fresh produce that's not rotten or doesn't have blemishes, and peeling certain things, heating things to the proper temperatures and processing them for the proper times. Now, the difference between water bath canning and pressure canning is that water bath canning is just a less extensive canning process, and therefore it does best with foods that are higher in acid. You can can a lot of things in water bath canning if you are pickling them or preparing them in some sort of sugar. So you're thinking about this, it's going to be your pickles, it's going to be things like jams and jellies, which do have that acid and the high sugar in them. Hey guys, it's Editing Jess here. I am reshooting this phrase because I misspoke and it would have been completely inaccurate information. I was mentioning water bath canning and what it is involved in. Pressure canning, which at this point my pressure canner is running. Pressure canning is used for low acid foods, things like pumpkin and beans, green beans, and any meat products that you are going to be processed, whether it's broths or meat. That is recommended to do with a pressure canner. This is because with the pressure canner, higher temperatures given the steam and the pressure can be achieved, which can be more effective at killing microorganisms that may be more apt to living in environments that don't have that high acid or sugar content. Now, people will sometimes ask, hey, which one do you prefer, water bath canning or pressure canning? They're really just completely different things that produce a very different product. So for me, water bath canning, I do think is more accessible. It's definitely something that's easier for people to get into because a pressure canner can cost up, this one I think is about $300, and that's obviously a big investment, whereas with water bath canning, you can just use a pot. However, you're making high acid food, so you're talking about your jams, your jellies, your pickled stuff, and there's only so much of that stuff that you can eat. So when we're talking about preparing ingredients that can be used for the sake of convenience in cooking whole foods and real foods, pressure canning is really an important part of that, to be able to put up things like meat and beans and a lot of the vegetables that aren't full of vinegar or sugar. I like both of them. They each have their application. I think they're both very good skills to learn. But if you're overwhelmed by the process, starting with water bath canning is less of an investment on the front end. If you know that you really want to preserve your garden food, have homemade convenience foods, pressure canning is definitely something that I would suggest planning on getting into. Now, the one thing that I just have to address on the front end also is a lot of people are like, aren't you afraid? Aren't you afraid that you're going to do it wrong and get everybody sick? And I will tell you that no, I'm really, really not afraid. Yes, there is a very, very mild chance of something called botulism. This is often thrown around, but if you go look up the records of people who deal with sickness from botulism, and of course, part of this is because there's not that much home canned food, the numbers are really low, but people get sick from fast food places way more frequently than they get sick from home canned products. And I do have enough confidence in myself to adhere to best practices to the point that I know I'm preparing things in a way that's hygienic, that I am doing things the best that I can. And I will say that most times if your canning goes wrong, it's very, very evident. Most times the worst case scenario in canning is that maybe you're going to open a jar and be like, ooh, this stinks. This is not good. Most of the time, if your canning is not good, it is very, very obvious, and there's no risk of getting sick unless you just eat rancid things like without noticing. You're gonna notice. And I can even tell you that in now 10 years of canning very regularly, I think I've opened up 1 or 2 jars over the years that there had been spoilage, and it usually came down to a failed seal on the lid, and it was just obvious. There was mold, it smelled bad, it was obvious. Another big fear that people deal with the pressure canner is the idea that it is kind of like a bomb and they're afraid that they're gonna blow up their kitchen. I hear that all the time. In fact, if I asked for a show of hands or comments of those of you who have pressure canners still sitting in the box in the bottom of your pantry or sitting in the back of a cabinet that hasn't been opened in years since you bought it, I see you. I know you're out there. I know you're scared to can. We're going to bust that canner out this year. You're going to put food on your shelves. It's not scary. These canners that are made now have a lot of safety features to them. And as long as you are going through the due diligence and being aware of best practices, you really don't have anything to be afraid of. I want to tell you a little bit about why I think that learning canning is a valuable skill in the arsenal of skills that you can have in the kitchen. And then I'll get into talking a little bit about tools and preparation. So I'll preface my why with telling you, in a lot of cases, I do not prefer home canned food. I much prefer eating food that's fresh, cooking it right then, and eating it. It tastes better. In a lot of cases, it tastes better. Not all cases. I've eaten some very delicious things that came from home canned food. But you are taking your perishable and fresh food in the process of canning, and you are heating it to the point that it is going to break down a lot of the enzymes and the bacteria. And therefore, home canned food to me is not what I am aiming to eat all the time. I would rather eat my food fresh where it has more nutritional value for me and that all of those enzymes are still alive. However, if it were not for home canned food, I would not be able to feed my family such a whole food diet. Home canned food introduces a level of security because it is not dependent on refrigeration or power to keep it fresh. The other thing is that it provides a lot of convenience. So today I'm working on canning beans. I'm going to shoot a video of that. That'll be up next. And the fact that I can take dry beans, one of the cheapest food sources and a source of protein and nutrition, and I can convert that very affordable product into ready to use home canned beans, and I'm not paying $1.50 a can for store-bought beans in cans. It's saving me money, it's providing me convenience, and on a busy weeknight, whenever I'm just trying to put dinner on the table, I can take a pound of hamburger meat, a couple of jars of the beans that I had previously canned. I can take some dried onion and dried garlic and dried peppers and throw all of these things in the pan with some seasoning and make a really great pot of chili, and it takes me less than 10 minutes hands-on time because I previously did the canning. Oh, and I have to put in cans of tomatoes that I canned as well. But still, I can make a dinner just straight off the pantries and go from zero plan, zero thawing out, zero preparation to a whole foods ingredients meal on the table in less than half an hour. That makes canning worth it to me. The other thing that's just super practical if you're going to garden and you're going to grow food, or if you're just going to shop locally and shop with local farmers and farmers markets, tomato plants don't grow year round. The harvest comes in a 2-month period, and we work really hard during that period to preserve those tomatoes so that we can eat them year round. And it's like that with so many of the things that we are producing on a farm, on a homestead, or purchasing locally from other farmers. They're getting all of their harvest in at one time, and therefore if you want to enjoy that harvest outside that window of time, you're going to have to learn to preserve it, and canning is a really great way to do that. So the last example, and I think I could probably go on, but these are just some of the things that I have been so spoiled by canning that the idea of just going to the store and purchasing them is mind-boggling to me. A couple of things that I will always keep canned, and it doesn't even have to be from homegrown products. If you buy 1 jar of organic jam or jelly at the grocery store, it can cost $4 to $5 for 1 jar of quality jam or jelly that doesn't have high fructose corn syrup in it, that was organically grown. $4 or $5 for one jar. I have 5 sons that I make lunch for every single day. We could literally spend, just eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, if I was buying those jars, we could easily spend $50 a month on jelly if I was just buying those little jars. Whereas I can purchase frozen berries, frozen organic berries from the store. I can get some good sugar that's not high fructose corn syrup, get some pectin, and I can make an entire case of jelly for a fraction of the price. Another example that I see for sale in grocery stores is broths, bone broths, chicken broths, different vegetable broth. And these broths for one 32-ounce container is often $3 to $5 depending on the quality of the broth you're buying. Some bone broths, I've seen even smaller containers being sold for $10 at the grocery store. I can make gallons of broth for a fraction of that price and then put it through my pressure canner, and I'll always have it available to me if I want to heat some up and drink it in a mug, or if I want to make soups, use it in any of my other cooking. I've got homemade broth. I know the ingredients that went into it. I know the process that went into it, and I have that at my convenience at a much cheaper price point. All right, so real quick, I'm going to show you a couple of the basic tools for the setup to can both water bath and pressure canning. You can find a lot of products for sale, and some of them are really cool, but I'm just going to show you kind of the baseline of the necessities you need to do it. So first, water bath canning. This is a particular canner. This is a water bath canner. I think this is made by, oh, it was wet. I think that this may be made by Ball. I'm not really sure. They sell these at Walmart. You can often find them at garage sales or on like Facebook Marketplace where people are getting rid of them. These are very inexpensive. They should be somewhere in the range of like maybe $30. Like if you see something online where someone's selling a water bath canner for $80, $90, $100, do not buy that. That is not a good deal. Someone's marking that up. The only thing that makes this different than like any other pot is that a lot of times if you were to buy a stock pot this big, it would be more narrow and taller, which for canning, you don't need that. This is wider. It is tall enough to put quart jars in and cover them with an inch of water, inch to 2 inches of water, which is what you need for water bath canning. And it's wide enough that you can fit several jars in here. The other thing that makes this special to be a canner, it has these ridges on the bottom of the pot. So you can just use a regular stock pot to can in. That's what I did for a really long time. I ended up finding this once, like at a garage sale, and I went ahead and bought it. But just a regular stock pot is fine. The only thing is that a regular stock pot is going to have a fully smooth bottom, and while you're processing, your jar can actually have a vacuum create between the bottom of your jar and the bottom of your canner. So you need something on the bottom of that canner that your jars can sit on, like a trivet, or I've even seen where people take several of these canning lids and they put it all along the bottom of their jar for their filled jars to sit on. I've seen where people do like a towel on the bottom. I used to have a trivet when I was just using a stock pot, and I can't even remember where it came from. It was just a round one. You can purchase these little canning racks. The All-American pressure canner came with a couple of these, and sometimes if I am canning like in a stock pot, if I'm going to water bath can, I'll just use one of these in the bottom. So if you don't want to buy a specific water bath canner, that's fine, but you may buy a product to put in the bottom of it or improvise with one of those ways I mentioned. If you buy this, it's going to come with a lid. You don't have to have a lid for water bath canning. It's beneficial when you're trying to heat your water up to be able to cover it because it'll help it come to temperature faster, but otherwise you don't need that. All right, now with a pressure canner. I have an All-American pressure canner is the brand that it is. There are a few different brands available, at least here in the United States, and they vary in price range. The reason I went for the All-American, it cost a little more on the front end, but it doesn't have a rubber gasket. So with the All-American, it's metal on metal. I'm pretty sure this is the only brand that's like that. This was my first pressure canner, so I've never pressure canned on any other brand. But with the metal on metal, I knew that was less things to wear out, less things to have to replace, and I typically am going to lean in that in my purchases. So there are multiple sizes of the All-American. I think it's the 21.5 quart. It's kind of like the middle grade one, the most common one. Now, it may may seem to you like, oh, I should get the biggest one that I can afford. If I'm gonna buy this, might as well spend a little extra and get the bigger one. Keep in mind that it's a lot taller and it may not fit on your stovetop. So if you have any sort of like range hood, especially if you have like a microwave over your range, that is important to keep in mind when you're picking which canner you're going to use. With different brands of pressure canners, they all come with an instruction guide. There may be a little bit of a different approach as far as like setting it up and getting it prepared to can, but the actual processing times and the actual process of canning is going to be the same. But make sure when you get your canner in that you hang on to that instruction guide, because it may be a little bit different depending on what brand you're using. Other tools that are really important to have for canning, I have an electric kettle, and I mean we use it for like making coffee and making tea and stuff like that, but it is very, very handy to use whenever you're canning and you maybe need to put like hot water over something. I use my electric kettle a lot in canning. Funnels of various sizes, wide mouth funnels, I think these came with like a ball kit. This is just a metal one that I got online. I have another big metal one that actually came from a dairy supply, and it got absorbed by the kitchen. This is another canning tool that I actually use a lot. This is a jar lifter. This is pretty non-negotiable for me. You don't have to buy any specific brand, but being able to get your jars out of the water when they're boiling hot, this is definitely a handy thing. And these tools are pretty inexpensive. They last forever once you have them. I think I've had this jar lifter for like 10 years now. So fun fact, when my oldest child was a little guy, he called this the grabber, and so that's what it is now in my mind. All right, so let's talk real briefly about jars. Now, here in the United States, the most popular jars to use are mason jars, which is this style of jar. Just because they're mason jars doesn't mean that they're always going to be like this. For instance, like here is a special edition one that Ball put out. It's shaped a little bit differently. The glass is a little different. It's kind of pink tinted. It looks a little different, but it's still considered a mason jar. Now, you can get mason jars in all different sizes. They come in limited editions. You can get little jam jars, jelly jars, 4-ounce jars. They can go all the way up to half gallon. The most common sizes you are going to find referenced in any sort of canning recipe or book or video is quarts and pints. Of course, there are also half pints that are popular for things that you just want a smaller amount of, but these are the two kind of like main go-tos. So I guess I should show this one as the example. And when you are canning with jars, what is recommended as best practice is that every time you can, you're going to use a new lid. Of course, when you buy a case of jars, they come with one lid. You can buy replacement packages of replacement lids. Now, I'll show you here. The reason why it is suggested to use a new lid every time is that there is this compound on the inside of the lid. And when you can, you're going to put the lid on. You're going to make sure everything is clean. Your food is in there. You're going to put the ring down, what's called finger tight, which means you're not going to just wrench this on. Just going to tighten it nice. It's tight, but you can take it off with your fingers. My 18-year-old didn't put it on. We don't ask him to put the lids on the canning jars because we'd never be able to open them again. So finger tight. And what happens is when this processes in the canner, it's going to create a vacuum and it's going to pull this lid down into this, and the rim of this jar is going to go up into that compound, which is softened by the canning process. And when you take these jars out, they're going to cool on the counter. You leave them there until they cool, and you'll hear this glorious sound of the lids popping, which is that vacuum being pulled into place. After your jars are completely cool, we take this ring off. At that point, this lid will be fully sealed on, and that's how we store our jars. The reason why we take the ring off is because if you do have a failed seal, let's say it pops off, it's just going to be a little more obvious to you. Whereas if you leave the rings on, it's not the end of the world if you've got a bunch of canned goods with the rings on. I choose to take mine off because what can happen is, let's say you got a seal, you put your food away in the pantry, and then for some reason the seal came undone. But if you've got this lid on there that's kind of holding it mostly tight, you might not realize that that food is spoiling. And while I'm not avoiding that situation because I'm afraid I'm going to make somebody sick, as I said, in the majority of cases, spoiled food or food that will make you sick is going to be very evident. But I don't want to be in the position of being in the middle of cooking dinner thinking I have the ingredient at hand and then learning right when it comes time to pour that in that it's really bad. So I store my jars with the rings off. One thing to note that is considered a best practice is that you do not want to stack canning jars in storage. If you do decide to do that, put something like cardboard between them so that it kind of helps evenly distribute the weight. I do not stack my canning jars. It can cause the seals to break. The main benefit of using a new lid every time is that you know you have enough of that compound in good enough shape that it's going to get a good seal. Because if you're going to go through all the work of preparing food, processing it, you really want that seal to last. If you are opposed to single-use items like lids, there are other options. These are called Tadler lids. These are actually a reusable lid and gasket system. I'm not 100% sure what the stance is of the strict rule followers on these. I'm pretty sure that these are approved. They are more of an investment. I do not use them exclusively. I will also use throwaway lids because I like to share my canned goods, and if I'm going to spend extra on something reusable, I don't want to give it away, especially not to somebody who doesn't know how to use it. So with these, you go through the exact same canning process like with the one single-use lids. You put the Tadler lid and gasket on, you put the ring down over it, you can it, and then afterwards it seals. After it's cool the next day, you take the rings off and you store these in a single layer. But whenever you go to open your canned good, you save these so that you can reuse them again. Now there's one other thing. There are what I'm going to call foreign canning jars to some of you. It's what you use because it's where you live. One brand is Weck. They have all different size jars. This just happens to be one of their juice ones, and it's one of the ones I have in my house. And these are very similar to the Tadler lids in the way they work. They have a glass top and they have a rubber gasket that you can process and seal. These come in all different sizes. They're not exactly the same size as our American canning jars. Like for instance, an American quart canning jar is 32 ounces, whereas I think the comparable size in the Weck jar is like 29 ounces. So it's close, but not exact. They're beautiful. Here, this is a Le Parfait, which is also a rubber gasket canning lid. These are not approved in American canning. This is what is used in canning in other parts of the world. I feel completely okay about canning in rubber gasket jars that are still actively used in a lot of places. However, they're very expensive. So while I love Weck jars, I would have a pantry full of Weck jars if I could. I just cannot justify the cost where you may pay $20 for 4 jars and from Weck jars, whereas with Ball you can pay $12 for a dozen of the jars that hold the same amount. So it really just comes down to numbers. I typically use my pretty jars for storing things. Like these are some dried mushrooms that I forage. Occasionally, if I'm going to make jam that I know we're going to use and that I want to have on the spread on the table, that's what I save those for. Something that I'm going to be able to enjoy their beauty, but they're not economical for me to use exclusively. Now, when it comes down to mason jar brands, one of the women who heavily influenced me when I first started learning canning was named Miss Shirley. She passed away a handful of years ago. She was one of the people who impressed upon me the importance of gardening with cattle panels, and she was a big believer in canning lots and lots of food. She taught me a lot of things. She came to my house and walked me through one of my early processes of canning. And Miss Shirley had the strongest opinion that you should only use Ball or Kerr mason jars, those 2 brands. And I just conceded in the beginning. I was like, okay, fine, whatever, you know, I'll listen to what you say. Later, years down the road, I remember being like, could it really matter that much? And picking up an unmarked case of jars at like a Dollar General store, coming home and canning in them. And I remember when I opened my canner, of course this is after Miss Shirley passed away, and like 4 out of the 7 jars had busted open and broken. And I just stood there looking in the canner and I was like, you were right, Miss Shirley. I'll listen to you from now on. So I am pretty picky. I will also preface this by saying I have noticed that in many of the canning materials that I've purchased, like Ball jars, the quality is not quite as good as it was pre-COVID. I think the demand just went up, and I've noticed the jars are a little thinner. With that being said, I still have a pretty low fail rate as far as jars breaking. And if you follow best practices by managing the temperatures of things right and packing them and not going from hot water to cold water and follow best practices, that will also eliminate breakage as well. It's one of those things that, like, very rarely do I hold a line on saying like, hey, you need to go with higher quality products here. But though we might save a few bucks on buying like a cheaper jar, we're ultimately going to lose money if we fill those up with our good food that we worked hard on and then it's ruined, because if those jars break in the canner, you're not eating that food. Now, one final thing I'd like to discuss that is very much a frequently asked canning question that I get is, hey, I see you're canning on a flat top stove. I thought that wasn't allowed. And people ask, like, how does that work? So yes, I do have an electric flat top stove. When we bought this house, this is what was in it. And I knew that I was taking a risk in canning on the stove, because with a canner full of jars and water, it's very heavy. And so obviously there is a risk of this breaking. And if you drop anything on your glass top stove, you could definitely break it. This is not an induction range. Induction is a little bit different. In fact, the way that induction ranges work, and I'm probably oversimplifying this, but they heat the pot instead of actually heating the element, and they do it through like some sort of magnetism. And a lot of induction stoves simply will not work with a canner. The way that the surface of the stove is with the bottom of the canner, the way that the canner conducts heat, they just don't work. You may need to look up the stove that you have and see if it actually does work with a canner. But a lot of the warning against flat tops is that you are risking breaking it. I mean, that's just true. It's the same thing with cooking with cast iron on a flat top stove. You're risking scratching it and you're risking breaking it. I've done it here for the last 2.5 years. I've lived in this house and I've been canning. Obviously, I haven't broken mine. For me, not canning just simply wasn't an option. I was gonna have to preserve food. And I figured, all right, well, if I replace this now, I'm 100% replacing it. Whereas if I just use it and break it, then there's only a chance I'm gonna have to replace it. So that was my approach. Obviously, you have a gas stove, you can totally use that. And what a lot of people choose to do, especially in the summer when it's really hot and they don't wanna heat up their kitchen, a lot of people use like a little gas-powered hot plate or an eye that they can heat up their canner with. A lot of people do it out on their porch. So you have options, but you also have to just decide what risk you want to take with your appliances. So every time I talk about that, I have a lot of people that pipe in and say, I've been canning on a glass top stove for years and I've never had any issues. So I know that there's a lot of that goes on, but I also understand why people feel some caution, because they're afraid to risk breaking their stove. I can't say that there's not a risk, but I can tell you it really hasn't been an issue at all for us. So that's kind of my introduction to canning. I think it is totally worth it. It definitely broadens your options as far as preserving your real food. It definitely brings in a lot of convenience, especially if you're trying to kick frozen foods from the grocery store, things that have a lot of added ingredients that you can't control. And it is actually a very simple thing to do once you get over the fears and the concerns that come from a lot of, honestly, just misinformation and a lack of understanding. So I am so excited to share canning with you guys. I'm gonna end this video now and start filming the next video where I'm gonna can all of these beans that I soaked last night. So keep an eye out for that video, it'll be out next. If you have canning resources that you love, feel free to comment. I will put links to all of the things that I mentioned in this video in the show notes, so you can check that out. And I would also love to know very specifically what you would like to learn to can. If you've thought about this, if there's something that you're currently buying from a grocery store shelf and you're thinking you'd like to find a cheaper way to obtain a product like that, let me know. If you're looking for convenience, if you're looking for preservation for your garden, I'd love to be able to help you guys with that. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I bless you. Until next time.